points about your Saturday exam. Everything is in Moodle. I think there are 1 or 2 videos which are remaining to be uploaded. That will be done by tonight. Basically, the question paper will not be shared in advance. The teachers are very fond of you and your behavior, so they have decided not to share it with you. There will be 6 questions, out of which you'll have to answer 4. Okay? 6 questions, out of which you'll have to answer 4. 4 multiplied by 2500. 100 marks. Okay? Now, out of these 6 questions, let me remember. 5 questions are sort of essay type. Essay type in the sense, not essay. In the question paper itself, you will find that it need not exceed 600 words. Okay? So 5 questions with 600 words answers, and 1 question which will be short answer. More than 1 short answer. Okay, 200 words. So 200 plus 200, 400 words for that 1 full answer. That's the pattern. That's part of the choice. You can take the short answer or leave it. That's your choice. Right? Short answer will be the 6th question. So 5 essay type questions and 6th question, short answer, out of which you'll have to answer 4. Is that clear? Any doubt? Sorry? 2 hours. 2 hours. 4 questions, half an hour for a question. That's what we do always. Okay? Half an hour for 500 words. That's more than adequate. Isn't it? No, there's no choice in it. Plan to answer 1 question in half an hour. Okay? That's the deal that you will have to give yourself. Okay? If you do that, you can easily finish it in 2 hours. Any other question? The 2 lectures that he was supposed to cover today are one, decolonization of primarily related to developing countries. That was the first lecture, and the second lecture was globalization and development. Okay, that's the 4 to 6 lecture. I'm going to follow that pattern. But before I move into the question of decolonization, in other words, the era where colonization ends and a lot of countries of the South become independent in the post-Second World War scenario, I want to spend a little bit of time, which probably Vineet left a bit incomplete in his last lecture, on colonization and colonialism and the challenges of development that most of these developing countries had when they became independent in the 1940s. One thing that is important to understand, often there is a view that is shared that when colonialism began, when the empire set in, most of the colonies that they captured and ruled were, before the colonial rule, very natural economies, natural societies, self-sufficient subsistence economies, non-monetized economies. Right? That's a usual perception that is shared. And colonialism came in and destroyed whatever was natural in these economies and societies. It destroyed whatever self-sufficiency existed in these economies and societies. It also destroyed all the non-monetized systems, barter kind of systems that existed, where cash nexus was not so important. Colonialism destroyed these mechanisms and then instituted, and of course oppressive, but which was less natural, market-based, not self-sufficient but trade-based, and non-monetized but cash-based economies. And this has been often cited as one of the major interventionary features of colonialism. But if you look closely at these economies and their histories, you will actually see that this kind of a perception of pre-colonial societies being natural, self-sufficient, and non-monetized is wrong. Right? Even if not totally wrong, it's a highly problematic argument which simply cannot be made without severe qualifications or riders. You can talk to me. Do you have a problem? Talk to me. Okay? Now, what? It is completely wrong to say that these economies before colonial rule did not have trade. Okay? China, India, for example, China was not as colonial a country as India was. Nevertheless, both these countries had very long traditions of trade, with not just internal trade, but also international trade. So, to say that trade was not important before colonialism is completely wrong. Okay? To say that these were economies where markets were not adequately developed, and so were these natural economies, is also completely wrong. If you look at histories, in India, if you take the Mughal period, or in other countries, if you take other periods before colonial rule, you will actually see markets were very well developed in many of these economies and societies. Okay? Thirdly, it is also not true that these economies were non-monetized before colonialism. Okay? If you look at if you look at Mughal rule in India, for example, this was the period when cash nexus, monetization of the economy, grew significantly. Okay? This was the period when the Mughal rulers, insisted that farmers should pay rent not in kind but in cash. Right? Not in kind, not in rice, in terms of wheat, but in terms of cash. Now, how does the peasant who is producing produce in his farm get this cash in order to pay the Mughal rulers? By selling it. Okay? He sells it, gets a price for it, and then pays the rent in cash. This means that there has to be a market. Okay? This means that there is indeed a cash nexus that is already present in these economies before colonialism set in. Right? So to follow the very naive kind of an understanding of colonialism, that colonialism came and brought in the market and killed the naturalness of these economies. Colonialism came and killed the self-sufficiency of these economies and made them dependent on trade. Colonialism came and monetized these economies and killed whatever non-monetized systems existed in these economies. That is completely wrong. But does that mean that colonialism did not have any influence on these economies? That's also not true. Okay? Two major features of colonialism are extremely important in terms of the changes they brought in the societies and economies of the developing world. First, they brought in major changes in the legal systems related to land ownership and possession. Okay? They completely dismantled whatever kind of land systems that existed in the pre-colonial period, and in order to maximize their revenues, which was the primary objective of colonialism, they brought in new forms of land systems, which we will see in more detail in the Indian case when we do India's development experience. They brought in new land systems which were designed to maximize land revenues. And thus they completely hit at the root of the old land systems that existed and brought in completely new systems of land, which, given the objective of this change, which was maximization of the revenues, ended up creating a system of agrarian relations where rents in agriculture were very high. More than 50% of the surplus, sometimes 60-70%, was paid as a rent from the surplus. Very little left for the peasant to either use for his own consumption, leave alone for investment in his farm. The second important change that they brought about was commercialization. Commercialization of agriculture. But it is not simply commercialization of agriculture. It is actually, to state it slightly differently, you can call it as the change in the commodity composition of the surplus in these economies. A change in the commodity composition of surplus in these economies. Is that clear? Change in the commodity composition of surplus. There is a surplus in agriculture, okay? But the kind of crops from which this surplus came from in the pre-colonial period and the type of crops from which this surplus came from in the colonial period were different. Right? And this choice of crops, which brought about a change in the commodity composition of these economies, cropping pattern of these economies, was guided by certain objectives of colonialism itself. Right? Example, cotton in India is a very good example of this kind of a change in the commodity composition of surplus in the rural areas. So that these commodities could become, if they were only traded within these countries before colonialism, now they could become globally exchangeable, globally tradable. Right? So this idea of being globally tradable, introduction of commodities and crops which are globally tradable or globally exchangeable, was the second most important change that colonialism brought into these economies and societies. Is that clear? Can I go ahead? Yes. Now this, but so in total, if you see, these two changes were the major changes, but colonialism brought about major changes in taxation. Taxation in the sense the rent that was sought from agriculture through charging of rents from tenants, purchase of products at less than market price, okay, so that they could be transported to the empire and then probably transported back into the colonies as finished products. For instance, cotton being transported as raw material at less than market price from India to Manchester and being brought back to India from Manchester as finished products, thus completely killing whatever weaving or artisanal industry that existed in India, is another example. Okay. Now, thirdly, colonialism also was a system that feasted on usury. Usury, U-S-U-R-Y. What is that? Yeah, but give me a better answer. Lending money private lending of money at interest rates which are much higher than what the market would charge it. Right? Market means what would a fair interest rate be? So that's the third most important change. Colonialism also thrived on direct tribute. Okay, from princely states, for example, they freely took direct tribute. Even when they allowed princely states to be autonomous in a particular sense of administration, they ensured that these princely states paid significant amounts of tribute to them in order to meet various needs of the colonial empire. For instance, some money would be charged for security, some money would be charged for military expenses, some money would be charged for upkeep of staff. Right? So all these reasons were cited in order to charge a particular tribute from these economies and societies. The implications of this kind of drain, so to say, Dadabhai Naoroji was to say that this was actually a drain of wealth from India. Right? Now, the drain of wealth had two major implications on the colonies. First, whatever surplus was produced, it was not that surplus was not produced. Surplus was produced, but it was taken away. The surplus that was produced in these colonies, were never reinvested in these economies, but instead drained out. Right? Is that clear to you? No? Yes, so the surplus that was created was taken away and never reinvested into these economies. Secondly, this kind of a pattern of growth stymied or slowed down or almost weakened the emergence and growth of an indigenous capitalist class. Okay, this weakened the possibilities, the potential of the emergence of a domestic indigenous capitalist class. Okay, that possibility was completely stymied. Is that clear? Can I go ahead? Yes. Okay. Now, these are the reasons why you will see, of course, in terms of real impacts, you will see fall of growth rates of these colonies, increase in poverty in these colonies, occasional bouts of hunger, famine, and widespread breaking out of epidemics and so on due to lack of education, lack of health, and so on. So these, of course, these impacts are there. But in terms of in an economic sense, if you see, the major impacts were complete absence of reinvestment of surplus and also the complete absence of the emergence of an indigenous capitalist class in these two economies. Lady to your right. Yes. Now, don't sleep right in front of me like this. Okay. Now, this was the background in which colonialism ended in large parts of the world, most parts of the world, though it continued in some parts. By the Second World War, the kind of capitalist dominance that existed, which could actually preserve a set of colonies, which could actually sustain the existence of a set of colonies for the empire, for countries like Britain, ended, and most countries of the world which were colonies received independence in the post-World War period by the late 1940s. Now, today's class is about what happened in this period. What happened in the period after independence, decolonization. After decolonization, what happened to these economies and societies. But before we see what happened to these economies and societies which became independent in 1947, we should actually see a little bit on what was happening in this period in the developed world. And after looking at what was happening in this period, post-World War period in the developed world, we will come into what was happening in the developing world. Now, clearly, in the period after the Second World War, the last class we spoke about the New Deal, which began in the United States in 1933. We also spoke about the birth of a welfare state, for example, in Britain in 1940s, okay, with the Beveridge Report, right? And which led to the emergence of a social security system, pensions, National Health Service, and so on. Now, this was actually followed up in the period after the Second World War through a set of Keynesian policies in the developed world. We are coming to the developing world later, but these Keynesian policies, which were founded on government expenditure and demand management on the one hand, higher government expenditure and increasing demand through that expenditure on the one hand, and second, a set of redistributive social policies on the other hand. So post-war developed countries had two sets of policies. One, they had a policy where Keynesian what? Keynesian demand, what does Keynesian demand management mean? The lady behind you, is that the way to sleep? You want to go out? Do you mind sitting straight? 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 Yes, okay, that's fine, thank you. Okay, now, the set of the combination of Keynesian demand policies and higher public expenditure on the one hand, okay, in order to generate growth, and on the other hand, a set of redistributive policies on the social front. These were the two arms of Keynesian policies that were followed in the developed world after the Second World War. Okay. Now here, there was increased public expenditure. Okay. Secondly, there were curbs on the flows of speculative finance capital, which had created the crisis in 1929. There were major curbs. Capital could not flow in and out of countries indiscriminately. Capital had to remain within the confines of the nation state in some way or the other. Though they were free to go out in other ways, but there were significant constraints on this kind of flow of finance capital across national boundaries. Thirdly, there were major concessions that were given to the working class in these countries, because the post-World War capitalist consensus in most of the developed world could not afford to keep the working class as an enemy of the capitalist. Okay? Germany was completely destroyed. Most European countries were devastated in the event of the Second World War. And the reconstruction of these European economies after the World War this process of reconstruction could not afford to have a hostile working class domestically. Okay? The presence of a hostile working class internally would have significantly disturbed the balance of the reconstruction efforts. And hence efforts were made in order to develop what they called in Britain as a social contract with labor. Social contract with labor. Okay? Whereby wages were allowed to rise, trade union rights were recognized, and trade unions were encouraged to function in these economies. Collective bargaining and shared prosperity was one of the major goals of social policy in this period. Okay? So wages were allowed to rise. Social security was provided to labor. Hire and fire, free hire and fire was not allowed in most countries. Job security was provided to laborers. So all these concessions were given, which otherwise would not have been available to labor in this period of the post-Second World War period. Okay? So this is often sometimes what we call as social democracy, as a type of public policy. This is social democracy. The idea that welfare state, a spending welfare state, which is redistributive, which allows labor some kind of concessions and allows some redistribution of the surplus in favor of the working class, in favor of the laborers, allows trade unions to function in some way, right? Thus buying their support for reconstruction of that capitalist economy. Right? This was in some sense the basis of what we call as welfare state, or sometimes what we call as social democracy. Right? So, but why was this required? Why was this required? This was partly required, of course. I'm sure you have heard of the term called Marshall Plan. What was Marshall Plan? For those who said no, I'll just explain it. But what was Marshall Plan? It was a plan that was extended to the European countries by the United States in order to reconstruct the war-torn economies like Germany and other countries of Europe. Right? So here you were looking at a set of financial aid and other forms of aid in kind as well to countries like Germany by United States. Now this was the United States very benevolent in order to allow this? It just became a very benevolent global, it just wants world peace, it just wants world prosperity, so it just freely aided Germany? No? Exactly, somebody said that. Somebody said the fear of Russia, right? Threat of global communism. Okay? That with the victory of Stalin over Hitler in 1945, fear began to arise that Hitler would step in from the eastern part and spread communism into larger parts of Western Europe as well. And hence, it was required for the United States, in order to stop that influence of communism coming from the eastern parts of Europe, to build not a wall, I wouldn't say wall was built later, but to sort of make the western parts of Europe immune to the threat of communism. And in order to make Western Europe immune to the onset of communism, it could not be allowed to remain poor. It could not be allowed to remain devastated. It could not be allowed to remain low growth. Yes? It had already begun in the 1920s. I wish that was true. I wish that was true. Global resource wars. In one word. Right? What? Global capitalism, in order to grow, requires newer and newer markets. Okay? And you cannot allow communist protectionism to shut off large parts of the globe to your markets, or to your products that you want to sell. Partly you also feel that they will tomorrow consume you as well. Is everything all right? Okay. Partly you also think that they will consume you tomorrow. Also, a whole lots of psychological, real and unreal threats are actually constructed in the mind and in the society as a whole in order to create this kind of a fear. That is the basis of the Cold War. The basis of the beginning of the Cold War. So you have here the threat of communism acting as a kind of incentive to these economies like United States to step in and create plans like Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Europe. But then Europe, as I already said, could not reconstruct itself domestically without some kind of alliance between capital and labor within. Okay? And it is in this alliance of capital and labor, which was built in the late 1940s onwards, that the root of welfare state, social democracy, all that exists. Right? So, in some sense, some people call it capitalism with a human face. Right? A capitalism. Social democracy means capitalism with a human face. In other words, it allows capital accumulation to happen on the one side, but gives some social security benefits, nets, etc. to the poor and working class on the other side. So that you could possibly call it capitalism with a global face. Some others call it welfare capitalism. Right? A capitalism, a system with some element of welfare policy built into it. Right? Some others also use this argument to say that capitalism can be run like that, and hence it can be internally reformed. Capitalism is not such a bad system after all. It can actually be reformed from within and all the oppressive elements of capitalism can actually be set aside, okay, can actually be eliminated by the active following of a social democratic policy, which can actually increase the future sustainability of capitalism as an economic and social system. A lot of arguments are thus forwarded in order to, in favor of such a social democratic system. Now, it has to be, however, understood, and it needs to be said, while one thing is real. What is real? The real is there was indeed some significant spread of social security benefits to the labor and the poor in the developed world in this period. Okay, that's something without doubt. That's factually completely true. Okay, I can show you a slide whereby you will actually see this for Europe. You will see from 1933. Can you see 1933? Okay, this is the share of the top 0.1% in the income share, right? From 1933, the New Deal begins. Even if you forget the war, if you will see from 43 to 48 onwards, you will actually see the share actually falling. Though not significantly, but it falls. Okay, it falls and it shows some element of redistribution within the capitalist system in favor of the non-capitalist classes. Right? Now, when does it end? 1978 appears to be the lowest point in that graph, right? 1978, the 80s, in other words, when the era of globalization begins, when the era of liberalization begins in the United States, Europe, and then later in large parts of the developing world as well, you actually see inequality levels beginning to rise again. This is the period, late 1970s, 1978 around, where we can say that the consensus that existed between capital and labor in the developed world of the West broke down. Right? The consensus, the social contract broke. Right? The consensus, the concessions that were given to labor in the period of reconstruction of Europe were withdrawn. Okay? And then the period of free market growth begins, and this is also a period. This is a graph from Piketty. You know Piketty? Thomas Piketty, right? Now, that's available freely on the internet, the book, a pirated copy. So now you can all go and read. There are beautiful lectures in the YouTube by Thomas Piketty, 1 hour, 1.5 hour lectures, including slides of his, which you can sometimes go and watch. Now, this is real. Right? So when we say there was a shift in the policies that were followed in the developed world, United States, Europe, and so on, in the post-war period, it was real because it was indeed redistributionary. Though not significantly redistributionary, but it was still, there was some element of redistribution in these policies. So, what are we trying to say here? The effect of concession to labor improved the distribution of income in these countries. In the US, the share of top 1% in total income was around 16, that the graph showed 0.01%, right? If you take 1% of in the total income, was 16% in 1940 and only 9% by the mid-1970s. So there was some redistribution away from the rich in this period. Similarly, the share of top 0.1% fell. Besides demand management, the activist role of the state in provision of unemployment insurance, widespread health benefits, old age pension benefits, all these were instituted in this period in the developed world. And today, the state in these countries, in the era of globalization, is trying to withdraw these benefits which were provided to the poor and the working class in that period. And that's the reason for Occupy London, Occupy New York, all those other struggles against rising unemployment in Europe and the United States that you see in this period have developed. Right? It is a period of rising inequality, as you see in this graph. It's also a period where there are increasing contestations and conflicts in these economies and societies of the West over withdrawal of the benefits that were provided to these people, the poor people in these countries, between 1946 and mid-1970s. When Keynesian demand management policies on the one hand and redistributive policies were followed on the other hand. Right? So the idea here was to make, as I said, capitalism with a human face. The idea was to also make capitalism more tolerable. Okay? Now, as I said, this is true and this is real. There is no question that this indeed happened. But that doesn't, however, mean, I would like to add as a qualification here, that this is not the whole story. This is not the whole story of it. Okay? The story is a little more complicated than that. Because first, while it did provide significant benefits to labor and the working class in these developed countries, this was also a period where the global onslaught by the United States against any kind of socialist, communist, or any slightly left kind of tendencies were crushed. Okay? Crushed militarily, physically, sometimes bloodshed, regime change, conspiracies, assassinations, whatnot. Okay? A whole set of international policies were unleashed on the developing world in order to ensure that this growth of capitalism with human face, this kind of shift of policies that were happening as part of Keynesian demand management policies in these countries remained in some form firmly in the control of capitalist countries and the capitalist classes. That's very clear. Okay? For example, you could actually see that 1950s, if you look at the United States society and economy, Have you heard of Joseph McCarthy? Joseph McCarthy? Who was Joseph McCarthy? Senator, yes, but who was he? Yeah, what did he do? Fair enough, but what did he do? What did he do inside the United States? Well, that's one. The bandit and all that. That's fine. But what did he do to the common people? Yes, exactly. So basically, this was a period when anybody who would actually even raise a voice which would be remotely left, okay, would be quickly branded as a communist and punished. Okay, university professors were one of the biggest casualties in freedom of research in American universities was a very important casualty in this period. No research funding was allowed for those projects which had that element into it, which had some element of radicalism built into it. Okay, there is a very famous American economist called Daniel Toner. Okay, Daniel Toner, who later came to India and has written one of the most fantastic treatises on India's agricultural and rural societies. Okay, and Daniel Toner and his wife Alice Toner were hounded in the United States. Okay, for holding opinions which Daniel Toner was hardly a communist, hardly even a socialist. He was just a man with his heart in the right place. Right, branded as communist. He fled the United States thanks to McCarthy's policies and never went back to the United States. He settled in Paris after a while in India. Okay? Joseph McCarthy was unleashed on the people of the United States, which was actually a terror regime in the 1950s. So in other words, this also, the welfare state, this is in some sense the underbelly of the welfare state. The underbelly of social democracy globally was in some sense a complete destruction of all kinds of democratic tendencies in the society. That's a flip side. That's a flip side. While you agree that this kind of fall of inequality or everything happened, it had a cost to it. Revolutionary upheavals in countries like Greece in the 1940s were brutally militarily suppressed. People's struggles in countries like Vietnam and Cuba were militarily diffused. Okay? In return for the Marshall Plan, Harry Truman, who was Harry Truman? Harry Truman insisted that communist parties were thrown out of post-war coalition governments in France and Italy in May 1947. Okay? I will not give you the benefits of the Marshall Plan if you do not remove these parties from your alliance. Okay? You have, as a result, a serious, a very significant network of policies unleashed across the world and within the United States to ensure that some kind of control of the capitalist class was retained. Secondly, of course, we have said it, that some kind of benefits were extended to the working class in this period, and a social security system was put in place. Trade unions were allowed to function more freely, unemployment declined, and wages increased in this period. That you see in this following graph. Now, in other words, what we are trying to say here is, this was a particular political conjuncture that existed in the 1950s and 1960s. This would not have existed, this would not have just come about in the 1930s or 1920s. This came about in the late 1940s because a particular political circumstance existed for that. The war had ended. Okay, there was a threat of, there was a political threat to the prevailing dominant ideology. There was actually Europe, which was devastated, which had to be rebuilt. Okay, and there was also a society which was divided significantly, and a consensus had to be built within these societies to go forward with a consensual economic policy. Right? All these needs coincided in the late 1940s to create this kind of an alliance, between capital and labor. Okay? Now, as a result, if you see, this period is often called as the golden age of capitalism. Okay? Golden age of capitalism. Why? Because 1950 to 1973, if you see the growth rates, 1913 to 1950, the world economy grew at a rate of just 1.85%. But in 1950 to 1973, the world economy grew at an unprecedented 4.9% in the period when these Keynesian demand policies were put in place. You see, in the late phase of the Keynesian demand management policies, 1970s, 1991 to 1980, you actually see the growth rate remaining high, but falling to 3.7, and then you see a consistent fall right into the 2000s, where in the 2000s, your world economy grows only at around 2.5%. Yes? Can we come to that towards the end? We'll come to that. Okay. Now, that's where you are. That's where you are. Now, this was the state of policy in the developed world, and this was the state of economy globally in this period, where across the world, even Richard Nixon, the American president, said in I think in 1972, he said, "We are all Keynesians now." Okay, we are all Keynesians now, because that was the prevailing consensus. Nobody thought any other policy was actually desirable for the world economy or for their own respective domestic economies. Okay? It was not, Keynesian demand management was not thrust on anyone. Okay? Like IMF and World Bank would thrust with conditionalities. Nobody thrust these. Every country realized that they were demand constrained. Supply will not create its own demand, as J.B. said from the marginalist school. They actually adopted these policies in full knowledge of the fact that they were demand constrained, and adopted it in order to generate demand, employment, and growth in these economies. Right? Now, if you move from here to the developing world, okay, that's what decolonization is all about. If you look at the developing world, you will actually see that the counterpart of Keynesian policies in the north was what we can call as state-led development in the south. Okay, here also the main inspiration was indeed Keynesian policies. The framework was Keynesian. There was planning and so on, but the main thrust was, you call, due to a specific set of features of this development policy, you actually end up calling it state-led development. Okay, why? First, one of the major emphasis of this new policy was industrialization. Okay, in other words, not agriculture. The emphasis on industrialization. In India, you had a Mahalanobis plan. In other countries, you had policies to generate growth of industry. Okay, why this thrust on industry? Because Jawaharlal Nehru in 1930, in the 1940s, I think, sometime said that we are trying to catch up as fast as we can with the industrial revolution that happened in the West 2 centuries ago. Okay, we are trying to catch up, because we are behind. We want to leap into that stage. We are trying to catch up as fast as we can to replicate the industrial revolution that happened in the West 2 centuries back. The thrust on industrialization in the economic policy of the developing countries after independence was due to one historical factor which was linked to colonialism in any form. Colonialism, as we have already stated, was apart from the reform of the land systems in these countries, it was also about changing the commodity composition of the surplus. In other words, it changed the cropping pattern of these countries significantly, so that these countries could be made to produce more commodities that could be globally exchangeable, globally tradable. In other words, by the 1940s, this created a particular division of labor across the world. This created some countries ended up specializing in producing certain goods, and some other countries ended up specializing in certain other goods, with this kind of guided colonial policy of changing the cropping pattern of countries. The South Asia, Africa, these economies became countries that exported primary commodities. And the West became economies which exported secondary commodities. So primary commodities moved from the south to the north, and industrial commodities moved from the north to the south. That became a division of labor that colonialism brought in. Okay, so countries like India export agricultural products and import industrial products. Countries like United States and Europe export industrial products and specialize in, and if at all there is any tropical commodities required, they will import it. What's wrong with this? What's wrong? I'm sorry? Even assuming that exchange takes place on an equal basis, is that a sustainable path? Even if you assume that this kind of benefit between this kind of trade between one set of countries exporting primary commodities and another set of countries exporting secondary commodities, right? Even if you assume that trade is equal as a level playing field, okay, is there an issue here? I said it can exchange for equal values. No. Well, trade cannot be ruled out. Trade has to exist in some form, right? You cannot live without trade. Yeah, but is that the problem with this? There's a slightly more technical problem that is associated with this kind of specialization or this kind of division of labor. One second. Yes. Yes, but before you reach there, yeah, I agree. Well, industrialization is also resource intensive. One would say that agriculture is less resource. We could say, well, it is not, but you could actually argue that agriculture is much less resource intensive than industry. No. Before that, as a general strategy, you can have technology in agro processing. It doesn't stop you. Yeah, you can have an agro-industrial complex in your own country because you are specializing in agriculture. Yes, but there's nothing that is fundamentally wrong with what you're saying. With that phenomenon, there's something else that is fundamentally wrong. I want to hear that. So, well. Before that, all that is fine, all that is correct. But there's a much more fundamental problem. Yes. Home demand for what? No. I'm sorry? You can have a labor intensive path in industry as well, if you want. You're right, I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm not dismissing that as a factor, but no, it's for equal values, right? You can have, that's what I'm saying. You can have value addition in agriculture. You can have value addition in agriculture. There are limits, I know, but there can be. I'm not dismissing all. Yes. I'm sorry? Excellent. Right? That's the point. What is the point that he's making? In other words, what the point here is. Oof, thank you for sitting. Now, the major problem here is when one set of countries specialize in the export of primary commodities and another set in secondary commodities. There is, he said demand for food, right? Is food like an industrial commodity? Because how much will you eat? As your income grows, you are a poor man, you earn 100 rupees, you spend 60 rupees say, or 70 rupees on food. Okay? Your income rises to 200 rupees. Will you end up spending 60 plus 60, 120 for food? Sorry? No, right? To an extent, but how much? How much? Okay, then you move from inferior cereals to superior cereals. Then your income increases to 300. What will you do? Another 60 you will spend on food? You won't. That's the limits, right? In other words, in economics you say that the income elasticity of demand for primary commodities is less than the income elasticity of demand for industrial commodities. In other words, as your income goes on increasing, the share of income that you would devote to the purchase of food, primary commodities, is increasingly lesser, right? And the share of your income that you would increasingly spend on non-agricultural commodities would increase. In other words, here there is an unequal feature of trade that is imposed on developing countries. Developing countries are specializing in the production of and export of a commodity which inherently is disadvantaged. Right? Am I right? Is it inherently disadvantaged? How much will you export? I can export cars much faster than I export rice. Or machines much faster, at a much faster rate than I export some food commodity. Why? Because in the long run, or in the medium run, at least in the medium run, because as your income increases, the share that is spent on food commodities declines faster than for non-agricultural commodities. This is the problem with this is the problem that colonialism thrust on these economies. These economies did not decide for themselves to move into cash crops. Did they? Was it a democratic movement in India or decision making in India that led to India shifting to cotton? Was it? No, it was thrust on it, right? By the empire, by colonialism. Right? In other words, historically, thanks to colonialism, these countries are disadvantaged in this kind of a trade phenomenon. You are specializing in the export of a commodity whose income elasticity of demand is lesser. Yes, do that faster. Yeah. Okay? So that is one of the major disadvantages of this. So colonialism created a pattern of global exchange and trade which was inherently biased against developing countries. Right? That's why the second point, they wanted to get out of it. They wanted to get out of this trap, as they call it. Okay? There's no point. We need to industrialize fast and get out of this colonialism thrust pattern of trade, which is unequal and inherently disadvantageous for us. And hence the thrust on industrialization in the economic policies of most countries that became independent in the 1940s. Is that clear? Is the reason for the shift clear? Any doubt? Can I take a question here? Oh, forget India. Forget India. We'll discuss India later. But as an idea, is that clear? Yeah? We'll come to that. We have a separate set of lectures on India. Yes. Yes, the lady here. Yeah. there is a feedback relationship between the two, but at the basis, at the very minimum, you have an equal situation here, right? The income elasticity of demand for non-agricultural commodities on an average will always remain higher than the income elasticity of demand for primary commodities. That remains. Only to the extent that they are based on agricultural raw materials. Isn't it? Mining. Not necessarily, not always. Yes and no. Yes and no, but not always. Not always. Electronics, right? Or automobiles, watchmaking, right? No, no, I'm not yet bringing in the question of sustainability here. We'll bring that up. In 3 lectures from now, there is a lecture on sustainability where you will deal with this exact problem of how this whole process of development can actually, how can we bring in and factor in element of sustainability into these discussions, right? Just hold your question till then, right? But here we are looking at a far more fundamental problem.